Imagine it is the morning of April 17th, 1825. You are a 34-year-old farmer named Jean-Baptiste living just outside Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Your farm is small, but yours. You grow coffee and sugarcane on land that your grandfather could not legally own because 20 years ago he was a slave. You wake up before sunrise every morning to tend the crops. Your house is made of timber and dried mud. You have a little money tucked away, enough for seed next season. Your children go to a school in the village. Life is hard, but life is free. And that word, free, means something different here than it does anywhere else on Earth. Because Haiti is the world's first black republic, the only nation in history founded by a successful slave revolt. People here beat an empire with their bare hands. You know that. Everyone here knows that. The air this morning smells like soil and wood smoke. The market in town is already noisy. Everything feels, for a moment, like a country that is actually going somewhere. You do not know what is sitting just off your coastline. You cannot see them yet, but they are there. 12 French warships, loaded with cannons, carrying a message from King Charles VI of France. Not a greeting, an ultimatum. If you have ever looked at a map of the world and wondered why the same countries are poor decade after decade, century after century, while the same countries stay rich no matter what happens, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is not a complaint. It is a pattern. It is played out on multiple continents, across multiple centuries, always with the same mechanics, always with the same result. The trap is real. It has a name. It has a face. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at global poverty the same way again. If this kind of historical depth is what you come here for, subscribing takes 2 seconds and it keeps you ahead of what most people will never understand about how this world actually functions. Now back to those 12 French warships. The message King Charles VI sent to Haiti in April of 1825 was simple and brutal. France would recognize Haiti's independence, which Haiti had already won with its own blood 2 decades earlier, but only on one condition. Haiti must pay France 150 million gold francs. That number needs to sink in. 150 million gold francs. French economists have since calculated that this indemnity was roughly equivalent to 300% of Haiti's entire annual economic output at the time. Think about that. Imagine being told you must pay 3 years of everything your country earns in cash to the country that used to own your people just to be left alone. And if you refuse, the warships will start firing. Haiti paid. It had no choice. The young nation borrowed the first installment from French banks at high interest, and then it borrowed more to pay back the first loan, and then it borrowed again. The debt compound, that is, it grew on top of itself the way a snowball rolling downhill grows, for over a century. Haiti did not finish paying off that original debt until 1947, 122 years later. The New York Times, in a 2022 investigation, calculated that the total amount Haiti paid, including loans taken to service the original debt, was equivalent to roughly $560 million in today's money. Other economists put the real economic cost, in terms of lost investment and lost growth, far higher, at estimates ranging toward $21 billion in modern value. He did everything that the story of hard work and prosperity is supposed to reward, but the system he lived inside was designed to prevent him from ever accumulating enough to change his situation. The floor had a drain in it. No matter how hard you filled the room, the water kept disappearing. That is the trap. And now I want you to drop a comment below with this question. Do you think this kind of institutional trap still exists today? Or is it something that only happened in the past? Because what I am about to show you next changes that question completely. And it changes everything. The second chapter of this story moves from the Caribbean to the heart of Africa. And it is, if anything, even more disturbing than Haiti, because it involves a country that should, by every measure of natural resources, be one of the wealthiest on Earth. The Democratic Republic of Congo sits at the center of Africa. Beneath its soil lies an estimated $24 trillion worth of mineral wealth. 24 trillion. That number is so large it is almost meaningless, so let me put it this way. The DRC holds roughly 80% of the world's known reserves of coltan, a mineral used in every smartphone, every laptop, every electric vehicle battery on the planet. It has massive deposits of cobalt, copper, diamonds, gold, uranium, and tin. If the DRC were a private company, it would be the most valuable company in human history. But the DRC is not rich. It is one of the poorest places on Earth. As of 2024, its GDP per capita is $686 per year. In 2024, its poverty rate was 72.9%. Nearly 3 out of every 4 people in the country with $24 trillion of wealth under their feet live in poverty. How does that happen? The same way it happened in Haiti. The pump was installed by someone else. It just never got turned off. In February of 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the entire Congo Basin, an area roughly the size of Western Europe, as his personal private property. Not Belgium's property, his property. He called it the Congo Free State, which was one of history's more brazen lies. What followed was a regime of forced labor, mutilation, and murder that historians now estimate killed between 5 and 10 million Congolese people. Leopold extracted rubber, ivory, and minerals with industrial efficiency. The infrastructure he built, the railroads, the trading posts, the administrative machinery, was designed entirely for extraction. Roads went from the mines to the river went to the sea went to Europe. There were no roads from town to town inside Congo. There was no need. This was not a country being built. It was a country being emptied. In 1960, Congo became independent. The Belgians left. But the institutional structure did not leave with them. The extractive framework, the mines owned by foreign companies, the political class incentivized to facilitate extraction in exchange for personal wealth, the absence of domestic industrial capacity, the legal structures that favored outside ownership. All of it stayed. It was as if the pump had been running for 75 years and had carved a groove so deep into the ground that even when the original operators left, the water kept flowing in the same direction. Out of the country, into the hands of whoever was connected to the outside world. Congo's post-independence history is one of the most painful examples of this dynamic anywhere. Leader after leader enriched themselves and their networks by facilitating the extraction of Congo's resources by foreign corporations. The country's people, who sat on the greatest concentration of mineral wealth on Earth, remained among the poorest in the world. And today, as the global demand for electric vehicles and electronics creates an almost insatiable hunger for cobalt and coltan, the mines of the DRC are busier than ever. The wealth is flowing. It is just not flowing to the 72.9% of Congolese who live in poverty. The pump is still running. It was just upgraded. Most people will never put these pieces together the way you're putting them right now. Most people see Haiti and think earthquake. They see Congo and think war. They do not see the mechanism underneath, the same mechanism, running in different costumes across different continents. If you are still here, you are seeing what most people miss. This channel exists for exactly this kind of clarity. Hit subscribe. Because what comes next is the most counterintuitive part of this story. The part that challenges everything you thought you knew about development, potential, and what it actually takes to break the trap. The third chapter of this story takes us somewhere different, not to a country destroyed by debt or drained by foreign extraction, but to a comparison that should be impossible. A side-by-side look at two countries that started in the same place and ended up in completely different worlds, and the gap between them is not explained by resources or geography or culture. It is explained entirely by the choices made in a window of about 15 years between 1960 and 1975. In 1961, the Philippines had a GDP per capita of approximately $2,110. South Korea, in the same year, had a GDP per capita of around $1,606. The Philippines was ahead. By the early 1960s, Manila was considered the most sophisticated city in Southeast Asia. American diplomats stationed in both countries reportedly joked among themselves about which of the two nations would one day become a developed economy. The smart money in the early 1960s was on the Philippines. South Korea had just survived a devastating war. Its economy was largely agrarian. It received foreign aid from multiple countries, including, strikingly, from several African nations that were better off than Korea at the time. South Korea in the early 1960s looked like exactly the kind of country that economists of that era expected to stay poor. Look at what happened next. South Korea, between roughly 1960 and 1990, experienced one of the most dramatic transformations in the economic history of the modern world. Its GDP per capita grew from around $79 in 1960 in nominal terms to over $6,000 by 1990. By 2023, it stood at $33,121. South Korea today is a high-income economy, a member of the OECD, which is the club of the world's wealthiest nations, home to global corporations like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. The Philippines in 2023 had a GDP per capita of roughly $3,900. It remains classified as a lower middle-income country by the World Bank. Some analysts project it may remain stuck in the middle-income trap until 2050. What happened? This is the heart of the question. Because if the answer were Korea got lucky, or Korea found oil, or Korea had some natural advantage, then the lesson would be useless. But that is not what happened. Korea had no significant natural resources. It had a war-scarred, largely illiterate rural population. It had nothing except a government that made a specific, deliberate set of institutional choices. The first choice was land reform. In the early 1950s, South Korea broke up the large land holdings of the elite land-owning class and redistributed land to small farmers. This was radical. This was the opposite of extractive. It created a large class of small property owners with a stake in the country's future. It broke the stranglehold of the old elite over the rural economy. In the Philippines, by contrast, the landholding oligarchy survived. Large families controlled vast agricultural estates for generations. The rural poor remained tenants, the elite remained the elite. And the political system reflected this, because the same families who owned the land also controlled the legislature, the courts, and the media. The second choice South Korea made was education. From the 1960s onward, Korea invested enormous resources in public education, literacy, technical skills, engineering, science. The country built human capital at an extraordinary pace. That workforce then powered a manufacturing revolution. Korea moved from subsistence farming to making steel, then ships, then electronics, then semiconductors in roughly 3 decades. The Philippines remained heavily dependent on agriculture and commodity exports for a far longer period. The third difference was the nature of the state. South Korea's government was authoritarian, yes, and that is not something to celebrate. But crucially, it was what economists call a developmental state. It was extractive in some ways, but it channeled what it extracted into national industrial building. The Korean state directed investment, subsidized key industries, and imposed discipline on its own companies. The Philippine state, for much of this period, was characterized by what scholars call elite capture. This means that the government worked primarily to protect the interests of the existing wealthy families rather than to build shared national capacity. Graft, patronage, and the entrenchment of privilege were systemic. 2 countries, same starting point in 1961, same rough geography, similar populations, no significant natural resource advantage for either. One made institutional choices that built inclusive economic infrastructure. One did not. Today, they live in different economic worlds. The gap between them is not a gap in talent or effort or culture. It is a gap in institutional design. And that gap was set in motion in a 15-year window half a century ago. Now observe what all 3 of these stories have in common. Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Philippines as contrasted against South Korea. Look at them together, and the same pattern surfaces in every single case. Across 3 different continents, 3 different eras, 3 entirely different historical contexts. In every case where a country remained poor, the same architecture was present. First, there was an institutional arrangement, usually created or reinforced by an outside power that directed resources away from broad-based development and toward a narrow group. Second, that arrangement persisted across political transitions. Independence, democracy, new governments, new leaders, none of these automatically changed the underlying structure. Third, the people at the bottom worked hard. They saved when they could. They sent their children to school when they could. Their effort was real, and it was sincere. But effort does not overcome structure. Swimming hard does not matter if the current is stronger than you are. The trap is not about the people inside it. The trap is about the water they are swimming in. The World Bank, in its 2024 World Development Report, put a number on this pattern. Since the 1990s, only 34 middle-income economies have successfully transitioned to high-income status. The rest, 108 countries at the end of 2023, remain stuck in what the report calls the middle-income trap. And since 1970, the median income per capita of middle-income countries has never risen above 10% of the United States income level. Think about that. 50-plus years of development programs, aid packages, structural adjustment loans, foreign investment, and microfinance initiatives, and the median middle-income country has not closed the gap. Not even to 10%. The gap has been roughly preserved for more than half a century. This is not a failure of effort. This is the performance of a trap doing exactly what traps do. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Now we need to talk about who actually gets hurt when this pattern plays out. Because it is not abstract. It is not a statistic. It has a face. And the face is almost always the same face. It is not the face of the very poorest. The very poorest, those living in extreme poverty, are devastated in ways that are immediate and visible. And they tend to attract attention. But the group that the trap destroys most quietly is the group that almost escaped. The middle, the savers, the small business owners, right? The teachers and nurses and farmers who did everything right. Argentina is perhaps the most vivid illustration of this specific cruelty. In the year 1900, Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries on earth by GDP per capita. It was comparable to France and Germany. Buenos Aires was one of the most sophisticated cities in the world. Argentina had educated people, fertile agricultural land, European immigrants with skills and ambition, and a thriving export economy built on beef and wheat. By every conventional measure of development theory at the time, Argentina should have become a high-income country. It was already halfway there. What it lacked was inclusive institutions. The wealth of Argentina was concentrated in a small landowning elite. The estancieros, the great cattle and grain estate owners. Political power flowed from them. Fiscal policy favored them. The state borrowed heavily to finance the lifestyles and infrastructure of the elite. Ordinary middle-class Argentines were told the system was working. The tradesmen, the clerks, the factory workers, the small farmers. And for stretches of time it appeared to be. But beneath the surface, the debts were building. The political instability was cycling. And the institutions were still fundamentally extractive in their orientation. The crisis came to a head in December of 2001. Argentina defaulted on approximately $95 billion in sovereign debt. At the time, it was the largest sovereign debt default in history. Overnight, the banks froze deposits. The government imposed strict limits on how much cash people could withdraw from their own accounts. This policy was called the corralito, which translates loosely as the little corral, meaning ordinary people were penned in like livestock while the financial system collapsed around them. Middle-class Argentines who had saved their entire lives watched their savings lose value by the day. The peso was forcibly devalued. Anyone with savings in pesos saw the purchasing power of those savings cut by roughly 70% within months. The rich were largely protected. Those with access to offshore accounts and foreign currency assets were safe. The poor had little to lose. It was the middle, the people who had trusted the system, who were annihilated. That is the specific cruelty of this trap. It does not just keep people poor at the bottom. It pulls people down from the middle. It punishes the most responsible members of a society. And it has happened to Argentina multiple times. Since its independence from Spain in 1816, Argentina has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times. 9. Not because its people are irresponsible, because its institutions keep recreating the same conditions. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only real question is whether the people inside it will see it clearly enough to protect themselves. Before we close, history does offer something other than despair. Because within these stories of structural traps, there are people who saw the mechanism clearly, and they responded in specific ways. The historical record is consistent about what those people did. They were not saints or geniuses. They were farmers and merchants and middle-class professionals who made a small number of clear-eyed choices when the system around them was under stress. The historical record shows that those who survived periods of economic decline shared 3 characteristics, not as a formula, not as financial advice, simply as a pattern seen across different countries and eras. The first characteristic was a refusal to trust a single system. In Argentina, in 2001, those who survived largely intact had diversified their savings. They had not kept everything in peso bank accounts. Some held assets in Uruguay, US dollars in cash. Some owned land or physical productive assets that could not be frozen by a government decree. Behind this is straightforward. When the extractive system fails, it fails in a specific and predictable way. Liquid and most domestically concentrated assets get seized, frozen, inflated, or devalued first. Diversification, which means not having all your eggs in one basket, is the oldest piece of economic advice in human history. Because it works. The Haitian coffee farmer who kept nothing but his land and his tools had more real security. The merchant who had all his savings in a French-linked bank. The second characteristic was an investment in skills and knowledge that transcended borders. In Haiti, in the Philippines, and Argentina, in every case where human capital was high, the person had more options when the institutional environment collapsed. Human capital means the knowledge and skills a person carries in their own mind. A skilled engineer, a multilingual trader, these people could move, could adapt. They could offer something of value regardless of what the local currency was doing. The government was in power. The historical survivors of economic collapse were overwhelmingly people whose most valuable asset could not be confiscated. Crosses borders. Bank accounts can be frozen. Not. The third characteristic was an early recognition of the pattern. In the 1920s, Weimar Germany, when the government began printing money to pay war reparations, some people recognized the early signs of hyperinflation. Hyperinflation means prices rising so fast that money becomes worthless, faster than you can spend it. Before the collapse was visible to everyone, they converted savings into hard assets. Foreign currency, commodities. The vast majority who waited until the headlines were screaming were too late. It is not about a specific investment. It is about the habit of reading structural signals early. Reads them. Most people wait for certainty before acting. Survivors acted on pattern recognition before certainty arrived. Now bring it back to where we began. Outside Port-au-Prince, April 17th, 1825. Tending his coffee plants as 12 French warships waited offshore. He did not know what was coming. He had no access to the financial and political mechanics. To change his country forever. He woke up, worked his land, something for his family, and trusted that the world was roughly as it appeared. Wrong, not because he was foolish. Forces moving against his future were invisible. institutional. Structures he did not have the tools to see. Within a year of that April morning, Haiti had agreed to the debt. For a generation, the money that should have built roads, schools, and hospitals was flowing across the Atlantic. Within 5 generations, the debt was finally repaid in 1947. Then, the institutions of poverty were deeply entrenched. Freedom from the debt barely registered as relief. Had long since been completed by then. The pattern Jean-Baptiste could not see in 1825 we can see now. Studies, we have the data, mechanism named and documented and measured. Since 1990, only 34 countries have escaped the middle income trap. 8 remain caught in it. The world's 26 poorest economies are deeper in debt today than at any point in the past 20 years. He still sits on $24 trillion worth of minerals. The pump is still running. The national level is almost never about effort. It is almost never about resources. It's never about the character of the people who live inside it. It is about architecture. Who built the system, what they built it to do. The people inside it ever gained enough power to rebuild it from the ground up. Haiti could not. South Korea could. When you strip everything away and look at the mechanism underneath, it is devastatingly simple. Inclusive institutions build. Institutions drain, and a country that has been drained long enough eventually forgets what it felt like to fill. Historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. The individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. Anything discussed in this or any other video, this video is not for everyone. We'll hear the word institutions and change the channel. But if one person in your life is trying to understand why the world looks the way it does, places stay poor no matter what happens. Why effort alone is never enough with them. Not because it will fix anything immediately. Clarity is the first step toward anything better. Subscribe for more economic history. Those channels will never touch. And I will see you in the next one.